An old woman was left to starve, abandoned by society and forgotten by those who should have cared. The mountain man, a figure of mystery and strength, broke the chains of her isolation with a simple act of kindness that changed everything. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The first snow had just dusted the rooftops of Hollow Creek, transforming the village into a pristine tableau of white against the darkening sky. John Smith pulled his worn coat tighter around his broad shoulders as he trudged along the outskirts of the settlement he once called home. The wind carried whispers through the pines, but beneath them, he caught something else, a metallic groan that didn't belong to the forest. His steps faltered. That sound wasn't natural. John followed it, each crunch of snow beneath his boots matching the quickening pace of his heart. The path led him past the edge of the village square toward the abandoned storehouse, its weathered planks gray against the fresh snow. What he found there stopped him cold. Mary Johnson, her silver hair tangled and dull, sat huddled against the storehouse wall. Iron chains bound her wrists and ankles to a post, the metal links rattling as she shivered in the biting cold. Her eyes, sunken in a face etched with lines of suffering, lifted to meet his, a silent plea swimming in their depths. "Water," the old woman whispered, her voice cracked from thirst. "Please." John glanced around, noticing several villagers hurrying past, their gazes deliberately averted from the suffering in their midst. A young mother pulled her curious child away, whispering harshly about keeping distance from the cursed one. An older man spat in the snow before hurrying away, his fists clenched at his sides, knuckles whitening. The mountain man's breath clouded before him in the frigid air, each exhale carrying memories of his own banishment years ago, the shame, the loneliness, the struggle to survive on the ridge while the community that raised him turned their backs. "She's paying for her sins," a voice murmured nearby. John turned to see Thomas Brown, the village blacksmith, watching with arms crossed over his chest. Elder Sarah declared it. Mary brought the sickness to the Johnson boy last spring. The chains stay until she confesses, or... The blacksmith didn't finish, but his meaning hung clear in the air between them. John's jaw tightened. He knew well how Elder Sarah Davis wielded tradition like a weapon, how fear kept the villagers in line. He had been cast out for questioning her authority once before. A soft whimper drew his attention back to Mary. The old woman's lips were cracked and blue, her thin frame trembling violently now. How long had she been here? Days, by the look of her. Something shifted in John's chest, a resolve hardening like ice. He had walked away from injustice once before, had learned to live with the weight of his silence. Not this time. With a single, resolute swing of his axe, John Smith shattered the iron chains that bound Mary Johnson. The sound of breaking metal echoed through the village square like thunder, a defiant challenge to years of unquestioned tradition. The heavy links fell to the snow-dusted ground, leaving only raw red marks on the old woman's wrists where they had bitten into her fragile skin. "What have you done?" someone shouted from the gathering crowd. Faces contorted with shock and anger as villagers realized someone had defied the elder's sacred decree. Thomas Brown pushed his way forward, his blacksmith's frame imposing as he pointed an accusing finger. "You'll bring a curse upon us all," the blacksmith bellowed, his voice carrying across the square. Others joined in, their voices rising in a chorus of superstition and fear. John ignored them all. He knelt beside Mary, whose eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, held a spark of disbelief. Her body trembled, from cold, from hunger, from the sudden rush of freedom she'd never expected to feel again. "Can you stand?" he asked softly. The old woman tried to rise but stumbled. Without hesitation, John gently hoisted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her once sturdy frame now reduced to bones and memories after days without proper nourishment. Her gray hair hung in tangled strands around her face as she clutched weakly at his coat. "The elders will hear of this," a woman hissed as John began walking through the crowd. He set his jaw and continued forward, each step deliberate and unwavering. Mary's breathing came in shallow gasps against his chest. The mountain man knew his cabin on the ridge was a long walk away, but he would carry her every step if necessary. As he passed through the stunned onlookers, reactions split like a lightning-struck tree. Some villagers spat curses, making signs to ward off evil. Others stepped back, fear evident in their wide eyes. Yet a few, mostly those who remembered Mary's kindnesses from before her shunning, watched in silent awe. A child reached out, almost touching Mary's dangling hand, before being yanked back by a terrified parent. Elder Sarah Davis would surely call for punishment when she heard, but in this moment, John cared only about getting Mary to safety. The weight in his arms felt like more than just a frail woman. It was the weight of defiance, of challenging what everyone in Hollow Creek had accepted without question for generations. As he reached the edge of the square, heading toward the path that would take them up to his isolated home, John sensed the world had shifted in that moment, not just for him and Mary, but for the entire village. Elder Sarah Davis stood at the steps of the meeting hall, her imposing figure casting a long shadow across the gathered villagers. The morning light caught in her silver hair, but did nothing to soften the coldness in her eyes, which resembled the mountain stones that surrounded Hollow Creek. "John Smith has defied our most sacred traditions," she declared, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "By breaking Mary's chains, he has invited calamity upon us all." Her gnarled finger pointed toward the ridge where John's cabin stood. "The spirits will not be denied their due. Our harvests will wither, our children will sicken, and winter will claim us all before spring returns." The villagers murmured anxiously, many nodding in agreement. Thomas Brown stepped forward. The blacksmith's muscular arms crossed over his chest as he voiced his support for the elder's words. "We've kept peace with the old ways for generations," Thomas said. "One man's misplaced compassion shouldn't doom us all." But far from the gathering, in his cabin on the ridge, John remained unmoved by their threats. He stirred a pot of broth, hanging over his hearth, adding herbs Martha had secretly provided the previous evening. The healer had come under cover of darkness, leaving a small bundle by his door with whispered instructions for Mary's recovery. "You need to drink this," John said gently, helping Mary sit up on his bed. Her frail body seemed to disappear beneath the rough blankets, but her eyes held a clarity that surprised him. Mary's hands trembled as she accepted the wooden bowl, her fingers thin but determined. "They will come for me," she whispered. "Sarah won't let this challenge go unanswered." "Let them come," he replied, his voice steady despite the weight in his chest. "I won't chain you again." As strength gradually returned to her body, Mary began to share stories in the firelight. Tales of spring blessings when the entire village would wade into the river. Singing songs to ensure bountiful harvests. She hummed melodies John had never heard, explaining how each note carried meaning now forgotten by most in Hollow Creek. "These songs were once our strength," she said one evening, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. "Not our chains." In Mary's stories, he found echoes of a community built on mutual care rather than fear. Outside, winter tightened its grip on the mountain. Inside, by the warmth of his hearth, something else was growing, a resolve that no elder's decree could shatter, and a bond that would soon challenge everything Hollow Creek believed about tradition and mercy. The frigid winds of January howled through Hollow Creek, carrying whispers that multiplied with each passing day. John Smith's defiance had split the village into factions. Some secretly admired his courage, while others condemned his foolishness. Thomas Brown, his forge blazing against the winter chill, became the loudest voice of opposition, warning that the mountain man's mercy would bring ruin upon them all. "He's disrupted the natural order," the blacksmith would declare to anyone who'd listen, hammering metal with particular force whenever John passed the workshop. Meanwhile, in the cabin on the ridge, Mary Johnson's transformation was undeniable. The woman who had arrived as a bundle of bones and fear now sat straighter by the hearth each evening. Her hands, once trembling and uncertain, steadied as she stirred the broth or mended torn fabric. The hollows in her cheeks gradually filled, and her eyes, once dull with resignation, now sparked with renewed purpose. The elders were wrong about her, John confided to Martha when the healer secretly visited, bringing dried herbs and quiet support. There's no curse in her, only wisdom, they feared. As snow piled against the cabin walls, the long nights became a sanctuary. Mary would wait until darkness had fully settled before her voice would rise, tentative at first, then growing in confidence. The melodies she sang were ancient, haunting tunes that had once accompanied the Spring River blessing before Elder Sarah had deemed them too pagan, too dangerous for modern sensibilities. My grandmother taught me these when I was no taller than a sapling, Mary explained one night, her weathered face illuminated by firelight. Before the village forgot what the songs were truly for, John would close his eyes, letting the music wash over him. In those moments, memories of his own mother surfaced, her gentle hands, her unwavering strength in the face of the village's scorn. She too had questioned traditions, had been pushed to the margins for it. The familiar ache of loneliness that had been his constant companion since childhood softened as Mary's songs filled the cabin. "You remind me of her," he admitted one evening, his voice rough with emotion. "She would have stood for you too." Mary reached across the space between them, her fingers light on his calloused hand. Then she raised a good man, despite what they say in the village. In those quiet exchanges, John found himself yearning for something he'd long abandoned, not just acceptance, but true belonging. The mountain had been his refuge, but in Mary's resilient spirit, he glimpsed the possibility of healing that ran deeper than solitude could provide. The river's icy grip had finally loosened with the arrival of spring, revealing slick stones and rushing waters that marked the time for Hollow Creek's most sacred ritual. Villagers gathered at dawn along the riverbank, their breath visible in the crisp morning air as they prepared for the spring river blessing. Children clutched small bundles of early wildflowers, while adults stood solemn-faced, removing their shoes to wade into the numbing waters as tradition demanded. Elder Sarah Davis stood at the river's center, her gray hair whipping in the wind as she raised gnarled hands toward the sky. Her voice carried across the water, reciting ancient prayers meant to ensure bountiful crops and protection from illness. Yet her concentration faltered, her sharp eyes repeatedly darting toward the ridge where John Smith and Mary Johnson watched from a respectful distance. "The waters reject those who defy our ways," Sarah announced, her voice hardening as several villagers glanced uncomfortably toward the outcasts. Thomas Brown, standing knee-deep in the current, nodded his approval, his blacksmith's arms crossed firmly across his chest. The ceremony continued with villagers taking turns to dip ceremonial baskets into the water, collecting what they believed to be blessed droplets for their homes and fields. The tension in the air was palpable. Many secretly wondered if Mary's presence, even from afar, might taint their ritual or bring misfortune. A sudden cry pierced the solemn atmosphere. Young Peter, the miller's son, had ventured too far onto the slippery stones. His small body tumbled forward, arms flailing as he plunged toward the deepest part of the current. His mother screamed, but before anyone could react, Mary was moving with surprising swiftness for her frail frame. The old woman reached the water's edge in moments, her weathered hands steady as she caught the frightened boy before the current could claim him. She pulled him to safety with gentle strength, murmuring words of comfort that seemed to calm him instantly. "There now, child," she said, wiping tears from his face. "The river is strong, but you are stronger." The gathering fell silent. Even elder Sarah stood speechless as Mary helped the boy back to his trembling mother, who whispered a tearful thank you despite the watchful eyes of the elders. As Mary returned to John's side on the ridge, whispers rippled through the crowd. Martha Johnson, the healer, was the first to speak aloud what many were thinking. "Perhaps the old woman isn't what we thought," she said quietly to those nearby. "Perhaps she keeps something precious we've forgotten." The spring blessing concluded with uncertain prayers and divided hearts. For the first time in generations, the villagers of Hollow Creek left the riverside wondering if their traditions had led them astray, and if wisdom might come from those they had cast aside. As spring breathed warmth into Hollow Creek, John Smith found himself sharing the knowledge he'd gathered during his years of solitude. Each morning, he guided Mary Johnson through the awakening forest, showing her how to set rabbit snares with gentle hands and identify which fallen branches would burn longest in the hearth. "You must watch for the tracks," John explained, kneeling beside a patch of disturbed earth. "See how they cross here? That's where we place the trap." Mary's thin fingers traced the pattern he indicated, her eyes bright with interest. Though her body remained frail, her spirit strengthened daily. The first time she successfully kindled a fire without assistance, her laughter rang through the trees like a forgotten melody, startling a nearby thrush into flight. "I haven't laughed like that in years," she confessed, watching the flames dance. In return for his lessons, Mary shared her own wisdom. During long evenings, she taught John the intricate patterns of weaving she'd mastered decades ago. His large hands, accustomed to axes and snares, fumbled with the delicate work, but he persisted under her patient guidance. "My mother taught me these patterns," Mary said one night, her voice soft with memory. "Each design tells a story of our mountains." As they worked, she sang in a low, melodious voice songs of ancient storms weathered, of harvests saved by kindness, of lovers reunited after terrible trials. These were the prophecies and legends that had once bound Hollow Creek together, before fear had twisted tradition into cruelty. Word spread through the village that the outcast and the once chained woman had created something remarkable in that cabin on the ridge. Children, naturally curious and less burdened by prejudice than their parents, began appearing at John's door. "Tell us about the river spirit," a small girl with braided hair requested one afternoon, settling cross-legged on the cabin floor. Soon 5 children became 8, then 12, gathering around Mary as she spun tales their parents had stopped telling, stories of courage and mercy that had been overshadowed by Elder Sarah's harsher teachings. John watched from his workbench, carving wooden figures that matched the characters in Mary's stories. The mountain man observed this transformation with quiet wonder. For years, he had built his life around solitude, convinced that isolation was his fate after being cast out. Now, his cabin hummed with voices, with questions, with the simple joy of shared stories. One evening, after the children had departed, John stood in the doorway, watching the sunset paint the distant peaks. "I never thought I'd have this again," he admitted to Mary, his voice rough with emotion. "Have what?" she asked. "People who aren't afraid to walk through my door." Summer Loom Fair transformed the village square into a tapestry of color. Woven fabrics in crimson, indigo, and amber hung from wooden frames, while the pungent aroma of natural dyes stung the nostrils of passers-by. Children darted between stalls, their laughter a counterpoint to the hushed tension that rippled beneath the surface of the gathering. Thomas Brown stood tall among the villagers, his blacksmith's arms crossed over his broad chest. The man had been waiting for this moment, when all of Hollow Creek would be assembled in one place. His voice carried across the square as he pointed toward John Smith, who stood quietly at the edge of the crowd with Mary Johnson at his side. "Look at him," Thomas called out, his finger accusatory. "He thinks himself above our ways, above the traditions that have kept this village safe for generations." The blacksmith's words found fertile ground among the fearful. John seeks to undo the order of Hollow Creek. What happens when we abandon our customs? When we ignore the warnings of our elders? Several villagers nodded, their eyes darting between Thomas and Elder Sarah Davis, who watched the confrontation with thin-lipped satisfaction. The blacksmith continued, his voice growing bolder with each word. The drought threatens our crops even now. Is this not proof that the spirits are displeased? John stepped forward, his weathered face calm despite the accusations. Mary remained behind him, her frail frame somehow dignified despite the whispers that followed her. The mountain man surveyed the faces before him, some hostile, others uncertain, a few openly curious. "I broke no law of nature," he said, his voice low but carrying across the suddenly quiet square. "I showed mercy to one who deserved no cruelty." He gestured toward the old woman. "Look at her. Has Mary brought plague upon us? Has she cursed your children or poisoned your wells?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A young mother clutched her child closer. "Our fear has brought us nothing but more fear," John continued. "Our cruelty has harvested only bitterness. If the spirits are angry, perhaps it is because we abandoned compassion, not because we embraced it." Thomas scoffed, but something in John's steady gaze made others pause. The villagers glanced between the two men, the blacksmith with his certainty and rage, and the outcast with his quiet conviction. "Choose what kind of village you wish to be," John said finally. "One that chains its elders to die, or one that honors wisdom even when it comes wrapped in forgiveness." As the summer breeze lifted the colorful banners overhead, Hollow Creek stood divided, caught between the comfort of old fears and the uncertain promise of a more merciful path. The sickening crack echoed across the festival grounds as John Smith collapsed. He had been hauling a massive pine log for the ceremonial pyre when his foot slipped on wet grass. The timber crashed down, wrenching his shoulder with such force that even the hardened mountain man couldn't suppress a cry of pain. "Let me through," Mary Johnson called, her frail voice somehow carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. Villagers parted reluctantly, some with sneers, others with curious glances, as the old woman hobbled toward the fallen man. "I can manage," John insisted through gritted teeth, attempting to rise. The pain shot through his arm like lightning, forcing him back down. Mary knelt beside him, her weathered hands surprisingly steady. "Stubborn as an ox," she muttered. "Just like my late husband." Without waiting for permission, she began examining his shoulder with practiced precision. Thomas Brown watched from the edge of the gathering, arms crossed. "Perhaps the spirits are showing their displeasure," the blacksmith announced loudly enough for all to hear. Several villagers nodded in agreement, but none stepped forward to help. Back at John's ridge cabin, Mary worked by lamplight, grinding herbs she'd gathered from the forest edge. The familiar scent of pine and yarrow filled the small room as she mixed the poultice. John sat silently, watching her methodical movements. "You've done this before," he observed as she deftly bound his shoulder with strips of homespun cloth. Mary's eyes crinkled slightly. "Now, I was the healer before Martha took over. Before they decided my remedies were," she paused, "dangerous." Night after night, as summer stars wheeled overhead, Mary tended to John's injury. She sang softly while changing his bandages, old songs of the mountain, melodies that spoke of endurance and renewal. For the first time in years, John found himself humming along, remembering fragments from his childhood. "My mother used to sing that one," he admitted one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. Mary nodded. Many mothers did before the elders forbade it. Their routine became a quiet rebellion, John chopping kindling one-handed, while Mary prepared meals from his dwindling stores. She never treated him with the wary distance the villagers maintained, never spoke to him as the outcast he'd become. Instead, she scolded his carelessness, praised his patience, and shared stories of her youth without reservation. Word spread through Hollow Creek. Children would sometimes appear at the cabin's edge, watching curiously before being hurried away by anxious parents. Martha Johnson visited once, ostensibly to check John's recovery, but her eyes lingered on Mary with something like remorse. As his strength returned, John realized something was healing beyond his shoulder. The hollow ache of isolation had begun to fade, replaced by something he'd nearly forgotten, the feeling of being truly seen, of belonging to someone. For both the mountain man and the old woman, their scars, visible and hidden, began to mend in the sanctuary they'd created together. The fields of Hollow Creek lay parched under the relentless summer sun. What had begun as a promising season now threatened to become a disaster as crops withered and streams ran shallow. Anxious glances were exchanged across garden fences as villagers watched their livelihood shrivel before their eyes. The timing couldn't have been worse. Harvest season approached with alarming speed, yet the skies remained stubbornly clear. "It's her," Thomas Brown muttered loudly in the village square, his blacksmith's apron stained with soot as he gestured toward John Smith's cabin on the ridge. The old woman should have been left to her fate. Now the spirits withhold the rain. His words found fertile ground among the fearful. Soon, whispers spread through Hollow Creek like wildfire. Mary Johnson had brought this curse upon them all. The blacksmith didn't stop there. Each morning at his forge, Thomas welcomed anxious farmers, stoking their fears as skillfully as he stoked his fire. The chains were there for a reason, he would say, hammering metal with deliberate, threatening strokes. She must be sent away before we all starve. When word reached John's cabin, Mary sat quietly by the window, her weathered hands steady despite the threat. "I've weathered worse storms than Thomas Brown," she told John, her voice carrying the calm of someone who had already survived her own execution. Rather than hiding away, Mary Johnson rose before dawn the next morning. Her frail frame moved with purpose as she gathered reeds from the creek bed. With nimble fingers that belied her age, she began weaving intricate harvest baskets, the kind traditionally carried during the autumn grain procession. "What are you doing?" John asked, concern etching his features. "Contributing," she replied simply. "They may hate me, but they'll use what I create." Day after day, Mary sat in plain view on John's porch, weaving basket after basket of exceptional quality. Some villagers passed by with scowls and muttered curses. Others slowed their pace, watching the old woman's skilled hands with reluctant fascination. Martha Johnson, the village healer, was the first to approach. She came under the pretense of gathering herbs, but lingered to observe Mary's technique. "My grandmother used to weave like that," she admitted quietly. "I'd forgotten how beautiful it could be." Mary simply nodded and continued her work, her defiance manifesting not in angry words, but in quiet productivity. Each completed basket stood as testimony against the accusations hurled at her, a silent argument that hands that created such beauty could not possibly be cursed. Even as Thomas rallied support for her banishment, Mary's baskets began appearing in homes throughout Hollow Creek, carried away by children, accepted by farmers' wives with downcast eyes but grateful hands. Her resistance was not in shouting, but in serving, and it confounded her enemies more than any protest could have. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the village square as the autumn grain procession began. Villagers gathered in their finest clothes, carrying woven baskets brimming with rye and corn. The harvest had been meager this year, making the ritual all the more solemn. John Smith watched from the edge of the crowd, his weathered face revealing nothing as Mary Johnson approached, her frail hands clutching a small basket she had woven herself. "I wish to give thanks too," Mary whispered, her voice steady despite the tension rippling through the assembly. Before she could take another step, Elder Sarah Davis moved with surprising swiftness for her age, positioning herself directly in Mary's path. The elder's eyes narrowed, her voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "Your presence will taint the blessing," Sarah declared, her tone leaving no room for argument. "The spirits require purity in those who seek their favor." A murmur passed through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge tradition. Thomas Brown, standing near the front with his own overflowing basket, smirked with satisfaction. John stepped forward without hesitation, his tall figure imposing as he positioned himself beside Mary. "If she cannot participate, then neither will I," he announced, his deep voice carrying across the square. The old woman straightened her spine, dignity radiating from her despite her years of mistreatment. She did not plead or argue, but stood with quiet defiance, her eyes meeting Sarah's without flinching. "The procession continues," Elder Sarah commanded, turning away dismissively. "Without them." The villagers formed their line, moving forward in practiced rhythm, their footsteps creating a somber cadence as they began their circuit around Hollow Creek. Mary and John remained where they stood, outcasts in the moment of community's greatest unity. Then something unexpected happened. A small girl with braided hair slipped away from her mother's side, darting across the square to stand beside Mary. The child reached up and took the old woman's hand, her innocent face upturned in a smile. One by one, other children followed. First, a boy of about 8, then 2 sisters with matching ribbons in their hair. They gathered around Mary and John, forming their own small procession parallel to the official one. Parents exchanged glances, some with alarm, others with something that looked surprisingly like pride. Martha Johnson, watching from her place in line, couldn't suppress a small smile. Even Ronan Davis, always calculating his advantage, seemed taken aback by the children's boldness. "Perhaps," whispered a farmer to his wife, "the blessing finds its own way." The 2 processions continued their paths, one following ancient tradition, the other forging something new from the courage of the young and the wisdom of the old. The burdens on John Smith's shoulders grew heavier with each passing day. Every morning, he would discover new threats carved into his cabin door, crude warnings and symbols meant to frighten him away from his compassion. The latest one, a jagged spiral ending in a skull, had appeared overnight, forcing him to sand the wood before Mary could see it. "They'll tire eventually," he told himself, though the constant vigilance was wearing him thin. The ridge that had once offered him solitude now felt like a fortress he had to defend. Villagers who once nodded in passing now averted their eyes, crossing to the other side of the path when they spotted him coming. At the trading post, conversations would halt abruptly when he entered. The mountain man could feel their stares boring into his back as he gathered supplies. Thomas Brown had been particularly effective in his campaign against them, suggesting that crops would fail and children would sicken as long as Mary remained in Hollow Creek. "You look tired," Mary observed one evening, her weathered hands working a small piece of cloth. "Perhaps you should return me to the village. Let them have their way." John shook his head firmly. "I've lived alone most of my life. Having someone to protect gives me purpose." But even as he spoke the words, he wondered how long they could continue this way. The isolation that had once been his choice now felt like a sentence they both endured. That night, as darkness settled over the ridge, a soft knock interrupted their simple meal. John grabbed his axe, approaching the door cautiously. Outside stood Martha Johnson, the village healer, her hood pulled low over her face. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "If Thomas or Elder Sarah knew." John ushered her inside, where Mary rose shakily to her feet, recognition dawning in her eyes. "Martha, is that truly you?" The healer's composure crumbled as she faced the older woman. "I've come to thank you and to beg forgiveness." Her voice trembled. 5 winters ago, when my little one was burning with fever, you gave me your last herbs, the ones you'd been saving for yourself." Martha reached for Mary's hands. "My son lives because of you, yet I said nothing when they chained you. I brought nothing when you hungered." Tears streamed down her face as she placed a small bundle on the table. "Medicines, for both of you, and word that not everyone believes the lies." As Martha slipped back into the night, John felt something shift inside him. Here was proof that courage could be contagious, that mercy might yet find root in Hollow Creek's stony soil. In that moment, he realized not everyone had turned their back on hope. The first sheep collapsed at dawn, followed by 2 more before midday. By sunset, half the village's livestock lay trembling in their pens, eyes glazed with fever. Whispers spread through Hollow Creek faster than the illness itself. This was no ordinary sickness. John Smith watched from his cabin as villagers gathered in anxious clusters. He recognized the symptoms from his years in the mountains: star-root fever, rare but deadly to animals. The cure grew only on the highest ridge, where wind-bent pines clung to rocky soil. "We need to gather mountain clover and pine sap," Mary Johnson said quietly, her weathered hands already preparing a worn satchel. "Mixed with spring water, it will draw out the fever." John hesitated. The ridge path is treacherous, especially now with early frost. Mary's eyes met his, determination evident in her gaze. "Those animals will die without help. I may be old, but these legs still know how to climb." Before dawn, they set out together, John's sturdy frame shielding Mary from the biting wind as they ascended. The old woman moved with surprising agility, pointing out herbs John had passed 100 times without notice. Her knowledge flowed freely: which roots to dig, which leaves to avoid, how to test the pine sap for potency. "My grandmother taught me these ways," she explained, fingers nimbly harvesting purple-tinged clover, before the elders decided such knowledge was dangerous. By midday, their satchels bulged with remedies. Back in the village, Mary worked tirelessly, brewing potions in John's hearth pot. The first farmer approached cautiously at dusk, desperation overcoming fear as his prized ewe lay dying. "Please," was all he said, hat clutched in calloused hands. The remedy worked overnight. By week's end, every afflicted animal had recovered, standing strong where death had seemed certain. Farmers nodded silently to John at the trading post, some leaving small offerings of cheese or wool at his doorstep. Gratitude they dared not express openly. Thomas Brown watched these developments with growing unease. The blacksmith pounded metal with unusual force, his voice carrying across the square. "Convenient timing, isn't it? First the animals sicken, then the witch provides a cure. Who's to say she didn't cause it?" Elder Sarah Davis appeared increasingly troubled, her authority visibly strained. At the weekly council, voices rose in unusual discord. "The old ways protected us," some insisted. "But Mary saved our livestock," others countered. John observed the division with quiet satisfaction. The rigid traditions that had once seemed unbreakable were beginning to crack, revealing something both frightening and hopeful beneath. Mary had shown them another path, one where wisdom and compassion might replace fear and punishment. In the privacy of his cabin, John stoked the fire as Mary sorted her remaining herbs. Neither spoke of the change taking root in Hollow Creek, but both felt it growing, steady and undeniable as the seasons themselves. As winter crept in, frost etched delicate patterns across the windows of Hollow Creek. Ronan Davis, the village trader, returned from his travels with a gleam in his eye that spoke of schemes rather than honest commerce. While unpacking his wares at the inn, he overheard whispers about Mary Johnson and the old woman's rehabilitation in the community. That night, as he nursed a mug of hot cider, Ronan's mind turned to profit. He remembered the tapestry Mary had woven years ago, an intricate work depicting the village's founding and the river that gave it life. The elders had deemed it dangerous, claiming its patterns contained forbidden knowledge. Now, with superstitions still ripe in neighboring settlements, he saw his chance. A cursed tapestry, he began telling travelers at market days in distant villages, woven by a witch from Hollow Creek. The cloth foretells disaster should it ever leave the mountains. His tales grew more elaborate with each telling, spinning stories of mysterious deaths and blighted crops tied to the fabric's power. The trader's plan was simple yet cunning. He would steal the tapestry from where it had been hidden in the meeting hall's storage room, then sell it to a collector from the southern valleys who traded in peculiar artifacts. The price would be enough to finally leave this backwater village behind. What Ronan hadn't counted on was John Smith's vigilance. The mountain man had developed keen instincts during his years of isolation, and he noticed the trader's unusual interest in the old meeting hall. One evening, while delivering firewood to Martha, John overheard Ronan negotiating with a stranger about the witch's weaving. 3 nights later, as snow began to fall in thick, silent flakes, John watched from the shadows as Ronan slipped behind the inn, a cloth-racked bundle tucked beneath his coat. The mountain man stepped from the darkness, blocking the narrow alley. "That doesn't belong to you," John said, his voice low but firm. Ronan startled, nearly dropping his precious cargo. "Mind your business, outcast," he hissed, clutching the bundle tighter. "Mary's work is my business," John replied, advancing slowly. "That tapestry holds her memories, her art, not some curse to be peddled for your gain." The trader's eyes darted toward the end of the alley, calculating his chances of escape. But John's broad shoulders filled the narrow space, and his resolve was unmistakable in the set of his jaw. "You've always been too clever for your own good, Ronan," John said, extending his hand. "Now give it back before the village learns how their trusted trader treats their history." The 2 men stood frozen in the falling snow, their breath clouding between them, while the fate of Mary's creation, and perhaps Hollow Creek itself, hung in the balance. Ronan Davis's face twisted in the dim light behind the inn as John Smith cornered him with the stolen tapestry clutched in his greedy hands. The trader's nervous laughter died when John pinned him against the rough wooden wall. "You think I don't know what you're planning?" John growled, his breath visible in the cold night air. Ronan's eyes darted frantically. "It's just business," he stammered. "People in the northern settlements would pay handsomely for a cursed relic, and you'd risk bringing more suffering to Mary for a few coins?" John tightened his grip on the trader's collar. Something broke in Ronan then. Perhaps his courage. Perhaps his conscience. "You don't understand," he whispered. "The curse was never real. It was Sarah who started that rumor years ago." John released him, stunned. "What are you saying?" "During the famine winter, when I was just a boy," Ronan explained, voice trembling, "Elder Sarah hoarded grain in her cellar while claiming our stores were depleted. When Mary discovered the truth, Sarah accused her of witchcraft to silence her. The cursed tapestry tale was just another way to keep everyone afraid of Mary." The revelation hit John like a physical blow. All these months of defending Mary against superstition, and the foundation had been nothing but a calculated lie. His hands shook with rage as he took the tapestry from Ronan's grasp. "Who else knows this?" John demanded. "Martha suspects. Thomas helped hide the grain. The older villagers, they chose to believe the lie because the truth was too shameful." Before dawn broke over the ridge, John stood at Elder Sarah's door, his shadow long and threatening against the fresh snow. When she answered, her face hardened at the sight of him holding Mary's tapestry. "I know what you did," John said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The grain you hid, the lies you spread about Mary." Sarah's expression never wavered. "I did what was necessary to maintain order. One woman's reputation against the stability of our entire village. It was an easy choice. Easy for you, John countered. You've built your authority on her suffering. And you would risk everything we've built here for what? Justice for one old woman? Sarah stepped closer, her eyes cold as the mountain stone. Our traditions keep us alive, John. Question them, and everything falls apart. John looked at the proud elder, seeing not strength, but fear. Fear of change, fear of losing control. The chains I broke weren't just around Mary's wrists, he said quietly. They're around this entire village, and I won't stop until everyone is free of them. Sarah's face paled, but her stance remained unyielding. Then you'll destroy us all, she whispered. The winter silence night had been observed in Hollow Creek for generations. As dusk settled over the valley, families emerged from their homes, carrying only small lanterns to guide their way to the village square. John Smith stood beside Mary Johnson, watching the solemn procession with a mixture of reverence and apprehension. Elder Sarah Davis presided over the ritual, her stern face illuminated by the last communal fire. "Tonight, we surrender to darkness," she announced, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "As our ancestors did, we humble ourselves before winter's might." One by one, each family approached the central fire to extinguish their lanterns. The darkness grew heavier with each passing moment, until only Sarah's torch remained. Thomas Brown stood at her side, his blacksmith's frame casting long shadows as he surveyed the villagers with suspicious eyes. "Extinction, sandwich, then now and then, they worry about you. And why not?" He's laughing, as he withstood from the mob, standing designing them. "Ladies, enjoy the first section, Melissa," as they wrapped up the present. Then, as we have more than that, and it seems like the text of the Goebbels brought us back to marriage. Now everyone gets to decide. The garden will end in dragon. "Our fields withered this past season," Sarah reminded them, her accusatory gaze finding Mary in the crowd. "The spirits demand respect and tradition." When the final light was extinguished, Hollow Creek plunged into complete darkness. The villagers huddled together, their breathing shallow with anticipation, and Mary trembled beside John, but not from fear. Something stirred within her, memories of rituals performed differently, with joy rather than dread. The wind's howl grew louder, rattling shutters and bending the pines that surrounded the village. "A storm comes," someone whispered fearfully. The worst timing. Martha Johnson, standing nearby with her children, caught Mary's eye in the darkness. A silent understanding passed between them. Without warning, Mary stepped forward into the center of the square. John reached for her but stopped himself, recognizing the determination in her stance. The old woman lifted her chin and opened her mouth, releasing a sound that had not been heard in Hollow Creek for decades, the opening notes of the River Blessing Song. Her voice, though frail, carried a clarity that silenced even the wind. The melody spoke of renewal rather than fear, of winter as slumber rather than death. A child, Martha's youngest, was the first to join, her small voice blending with Mary's. Then another child, and another. The traitor Ronan Davis shifted uncomfortably as his own daughter added her voice to the growing chorus. Sarah attempted to interrupt, but Thomas placed a restraining hand on her arm, his expression unreadable in the darkness. Parents began to hum along, remembering fragments of songs from their own childhoods. The storm that had threatened at the valley's edge seemed to pause, the wind dropping to a gentle whisper as the village found its voice. John watched in wonder as Hollow Creek transformed, not through fire or force, but through the simple courage of an old woman who refused to forget. The storm that had threatened to devour Hollow Creek suddenly calmed, as if Mary Johnson's ancient melody had tamed the very winds themselves. The last notes of her song hung in the air, fading into a silence more profound than any the villagers had known. Snow continued to fall, but gently now, each flake drifting down with purpose rather than fury. "It's stopping," a child whispered, voice filled with wonder. The villagers stood motionless, their breath visible in the cold night air. Something fundamental had shifted in that moment, a collective realization spreading through the gathering like ripples on still water. Where fear had once gripped their hearts, a tentative warmth now bloomed. John Smith watched as the faces around him transformed. The same people who had spat at his feet months ago now looked at Mary with something approaching reverence. The old woman stood tall despite her frail frame, dignity radiating from her like heat from embers. "The songs were never a curse," Martha said, breaking the silence. The healer stepped forward, her voice gaining strength. "They were our protection all along." Elder Sarah remained at the edge of the crowd, her authority visibly diminishing as villagers turned away from her toward Mary and John. The mountain man placed his hand gently on Mary's shoulder, his weathered face illuminated by the single torch that had remained lit throughout the ceremony. "My grandmother sang these songs," Thomas Brown admitted, surprising everyone, including himself. The blacksmith's voice cracked with emotion. "Before we forgot them, before we chose fear." In the firelight, the scars on John's arms and face, earned from years of solitary survival on the ridge, seemed to gleam, not as marks of shame, but as testament to endurance. Villagers who had once averted their eyes now looked directly at him, seeing strength where they had once perceived only threat. Mary reached up to clasp John's hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "The old ways weren't about punishment," she said, addressing everyone. "They were about protection, about standing together." Ronan Davis hung back, his schemes momentarily forgotten as he witnessed the transformation around him. Children pressed closer to Mary, no longer held back by their parents' restraining hands. "We nearly lost everything," an old farmer said, his voice carrying across the square. "Not because we spared her, but because we abandoned mercy." As the night deepened around them, the people of Hollow Creek understood with startling clarity that their salvation had come not from chains and exile, but from the very compassion they had rejected. In John's defiance and Mary's forgiveness, they had found a strength that no ritual of cruelty could ever provide. In the days that followed Winter Silence Night, Elder Sarah Davis watched her authority crumble like the walls of the meeting hall during spring thaw. Word of her deception spread through Hollow Creek faster than wildfire. How she had hidden grain during a desperate winter and scapegoated Mary Johnson to preserve her own standing. Children whispered it in doorways while women exchanged knowing glances at the well. "The old ways weren't always right," Martha Johnson declared one morning, standing tall in the village square. The healer's voice carried across the gathered crowd, stronger than anyone had heard before. "I've seen Mary's kindness firsthand when she saved my child with her last herbs." Sarah tried to rally support, citing traditions that had protected them for generations, but her words fell on ears newly opened to possibility. Thomas Brown, the blacksmith, still grumbled about dangerous changes, but even his protests grew quieter as neighbors began questioning practices they had blindly followed. In the meeting hall, villagers gathered not to reinforce old fears, but to reimagine their community. Mary sat among them, her thin shoulders straight, her eyes bright with vindication. No longer the outcast, she became the elder they truly needed, one whose wisdom came from suffering and forgiveness rather than rigid doctrine. "The spirits don't demand cruelty," Mary explained, her weathered hands gesturing toward the mountains. "They ask only that we care for one another through harsh winters and uncertain harvests." John Smith watched this transformation from the edge of gatherings, still more comfortable in silence than celebration. Yet the mountain man found himself drawn into conversations, his opinions sought on matters from hunting boundaries to festival planning. Children no longer scattered at his approach, but raced to walk beside him, peppering him with questions about life on the ridge. "You've earned your place here," Ronan told him grudgingly one evening outside the inn, the trader's opportunism tempered by newfound respect. "Not many would have stood against the whole village for what's right." John's cabin, once a lonely outpost, became a waypoint for villagers seeking counsel or simply conversation. The scars on his hands from breaking Mary's chains had faded, but the memory of that act of defiance had permanently altered Hollow Creek's understanding of courage. For Mary, dignity returned like spring after the harshest winter. Women who once crossed the street to avoid her now brought baskets of fresh bread to her door, eager to learn the old songs and remedies she had preserved. Her frail frame still carried the memory of chains, but her spirit stood unbroken, a testament to resilience that inspired even the most skeptical villagers. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, children would scamper up the path to John Smith's cabin, their eager footsteps announcing their arrival before their voices did. Mary Johnson would be waiting on the porch, her weathered hands ready to guide small fingers through the intricate patterns of basket weaving or the delicate movements of the loom. "Gentle now," she would instruct, her voice soft yet clear as a young girl attempted her first weave. "The threads remember the touch of your hands." The children listened with rapt attention, absorbing not just the craft but the stories Mary wove between instructions, tales of river spirits and mountain guardians that had been whispered in Hollow Creek for generations before fear that silenced them. John watched from the doorway, a quiet smile playing on his lips. The mountain man, who had once known only solitude, now found his home filled with laughter and song. Sometimes he would join them, his large hands surprisingly nimble as he helped the youngest children with their work, or added his deep voice to Mary's when she taught them the old melodies of the Spring River Blessing. "My grandmother sang this very song when I was no bigger than you," Mary told a wide-eyed boy of 7, as she guided him through a particularly haunting verse. And her grandmother before her. The river remembers, even when people forget. The knowledge Mary shared spread beyond the children. Parents who had initially forbidden their little ones from visiting the cabin found themselves drawn by curiosity, then held by respect. They would arrive with hesitation, but leave carrying more than just newly crafted baskets. They carried renewed connections to traditions they had been taught to fear. Martha Johnson, the village healer, became a regular visitor, bringing herbs to share and staying to learn the healing songs that complemented her remedies. "These words strengthen the medicine," Mary explained as they worked side by side, "just as kindness strengthens the heart." For John, these gatherings healed wounds deeper than any physical scar. The outcast who had defied tradition for mercy's sake found himself no longer standing outside the circle, but at its very center. Not because he had conformed, but because the village had begun to see through his eyes, to recognize courage where they had once seen only rebellion. One evening, as the children departed down the path, Thomas Brown's son lingered behind. The blacksmith's boy, once forbidden to speak to the mountain man, looked up at John with earnest eyes. "Father says you're the bravest man in Hollow Creek," he said simply before racing after his friends. John stood speechless, watching the boy disappear into the dusk. Beside him, Mary squeezed his hand, understanding without words what this acceptance meant to a heart that had hungered for belonging for so long. As the year turned, Hollow Creek's festivals took on new meaning. The Spring River Blessing, once a somber ritual performed under Elder Sarah Davis's stern gaze, now echoed with Mary Johnson's ancient melodies. Villagers stood knee-deep in the thawing waters, their voices rising in harmony as they sang songs that had nearly been lost to time and fear. Children splashed playfully, no longer afraid of angering unseen spirits, while their parents watched with newfound wonder. At the loom fair, where Thomas Brown had once stirred unrest, colorful tapestries now hung alongside Mary's intricate weavings. The blacksmith himself stood quietly at the edge of the celebration, his resistance softened by the undeniable prosperity that had returned to Hollow Creek. Martha Johnson proudly displayed her healing herbs beside Mary's baskets, their friendship now open for all to see. John Smith and Mary watched these transformations from the ridge path leading to his cabin. The mountain man's weathered face had softened over the months, lines of worry replaced by quiet contentment. Beside him, the old woman stood straighter now, her dignity fully restored, her wisdom sought rather than shunned. "I never thought I'd see the day," Mary whispered, her eyes following the dancers in the square below. "They remember the old ways now, but without the fear." John nodded, remembering the metallic groan of chains he had shattered nearly a year before. "People can change when given the chance," he replied, his voice low and thoughtful. From below, Ronan Davis caught sight of them and raised his hand in greeting, a gesture that would have been unthinkable months earlier. The trader had abandoned his schemes after John's confrontation, finding more honest ways to ply his trade. Even Sarah, though diminished in authority, had found a place in the new order of things. Her knowledge of tradition, once wielded as a weapon, now served as context for the gentler customs the village embraced. What had once been a place of exile and silence had transformed into a home bound by compassion and the courage to challenge fear. The villagers no longer turned away from suffering, having learned that mercy strengthened rather than weakened their community. As twilight descended, John and Mary made their way down to join the festivities. No longer outsiders, they were welcomed with warm embraces and shared cups of cider. The scars they carried, both visible and hidden, had become threads in the fabric of a village reborn, woven together with the strength to forgive and the wisdom to change. By the next snowfall, Hollow Creek's story had changed forever. The village square, once the site of Mary Johnson's suffering, now hosted weekly gatherings where elders and children alike shared stories beneath the stars. The old woman, her silver hair catching the firelight, now stood as living proof that mercy could sustain a people, and that hope could break the strongest chains. Mary moved through the village with quiet dignity, her frail frame carrying a strength that commanded respect. She had taken to teaching the young ones how to weave baskets and cloth, her nimble fingers guiding theirs through ancient patterns their parents had nearly forgotten. The children adored her, clustering around her cabin each afternoon, eager for tales of the mountain's oldest days. What stunned the villagers most was not just that John Smith broke the chains, but that he gave hope where they had chosen despair. The mountain man now served on the village council, his voice measured but firm when discussing matters of justice and compassion. His cabin, once a lonely outpost, had become a place of gathering and healing. Even Thomas Brown had softened his stance. The blacksmith, still proud but humbled by the turn of events, now forged ceremonial tokens for the Spring River blessing instead of chains. He had approached Mary one winter morning, offering a wordless apology in the form of a finely crafted hearth tool for her cabin. Elder Sarah Davis remained in the village, though her authority had diminished. She walked with eyes downcast, the weight of her deceptions visible in her stooped shoulders. Yet, in time, even she found a measure of redemption by tending the community garden alongside those she once condemned. Martha Johnson had stepped forward to become the new head elder, her healing hands now guiding the village with wisdom tempered by kindness. Under her leadership, the old rituals remained, but you're transformed, no longer tools of fear, but celebrations of community resilience. In that single act of defiance months before, John had changed not only one woman's fate, but the story Hollow Creek would tell for generations. Children now learned that courage sometimes meant standing alone, that tradition without compassion was merely cruelty wearing a familiar mask. As winter deepened, John and Mary sat by his hearth, watching snowflakes dance beyond the window. Their unlikely friendship had rewritten an ancient wrong and offered Hollow Creek a new beginning, one built not on fear of spirits or seasons, but on the simple, revolutionary power of human kindness.